remember a time when movies were major events in Western culture? A time when a movie would come out and if it was interesting enough, all eyes seemed to be on it. A time when doing the same kind of movie as before without any new ideas was a death sentence for its box office. A time when pandering was minimal at its worst and the story of a movie was a studio's highest priority. A time when the technology for practical effects was cutting edge. A magical time in cinema when movies were either good, bad, or just okay, and no other explanation was needed. That time was the magical decade of the 80s. There's something special about 80s movies that helped to add to the magic of cinema in a way that the last decade of films just doesn't. There was a secret sauce, if you will, that seems omitted in film recipes today that audiences really took for granted when these movies were at their height, and that's fresh ideas. One of the great movies at that time is the cult classic and Paul Verhoeven-directed masterpiece, Robocop. Robocop has an interesting premise of an officer killed in the line of duty whose body gets turned into the cyborg by the corporation that funds the police in this dystopian version of Detroit. Robocop is then released into the city and immediately starts to clean house, one crime at a time. This movie delves into some rather serious subjects like, is Murphy still a man, or property of the company that rebuilt him after his death? Is he still a cop in the traditional sense, or a potential replacement for all fully human police? Does he even have the authority to enforce the law? The movie also implies other questions like, does Murphy still have the capacity to love? Would his wife and child want to be around him? Does he still have a soul? I mean, it's rather deep when you think about it, and while I think that this movie would only have benefited from delving deeper into some of those questions and philosophies, I'm glad they're there. The main villains of the film are actually two villains. The first is the number 2 guy at OCP, the same company that makes Robocop, Dick Jones, and the other is Clarence Boddicker, the head of the organized crime group that is responsible for the hero's death in the first place. And while the final battle between Robocop and Clarence Boddicker may have been the bloodiest, it's actually Dick Jones that's the main threat to Robocop's existence. One of my absolute favorite parts of this movie are the over-the-top satirical commercials and news reports laced throughout. In a lot of ways, this movie is very serious, but Verhoeven is a master at creating satire that isn't serious at all, while still keeping the illusion of seriousness within the movie. This kind of comedic satire might be used a lot now, but I still think that Verhoeven did it best. It's absolutely great and showcases perfectly how movies in that decade had to have original elements to them in order to be competitive. Robocop is a lot of things: violent, satirical, dramatic, but on top of all of those things, it was original, and that originality is an ingredient missing in almost all films today. Okay, let's address something. A common complaint that I hear about 80s films today is that the acting is, for lack of a better term, cheesy, especially in films like this, where some of the side characters aren't the best known actors of their time. I understand this argument greatly because when I was younger, I also found the acting to be cheesy, even though I loved it. In the late 90s, for instance, I started to really get into film, and I was nearing college where I either wanted to study to be a filmmaker or to be a film critic. As I started to form opinions about the films that I was watching, I realized that my beloved 80s movies had a common problem, and that was the cheesy acting. I even went so far as to stupidly claim that most 80s movies would not be considered classic cinema the same way that great films of the past were, like Psycho or Seven Samurai. Looking back, I now know how wrong I was. Hey, cut me some slack. I was a teen and I still had a lot to learn about film. It took me some time, as I'm sure it did a lot of people, to really appreciate what the 80s did for the film industry and how movies like Robocop added to the movie-going experience, not took away from it. Movies like Robocop are great because of originality. Consider horror films like A Nightmare on Elm Street or The Thing, or science fiction films like They Live, The Fly, or Scanners. The performances aren't always great from every actor, but what the audience got instead was an original idea with a talented and motivated group of filmmakers, each trying hard to portray their ideas on screen to wow the audience with new and innovative technological marvels. In other words, it was still an art form. Perhaps not the same kind of art as the perfectly shot and acted Francis Ford Coppola classic The Godfather or Stanley Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey, but rather it's more reminiscent of movie classics with incredibly original ideas like The Planet of the Apes or Night of the Living Dead. Robocop fits right in with the pantheon of movie ideas, so original it spawned an attempt to recapture that lightning in a bottle over the decades since its release. Paul Verhoeven Verhoeven is a visionary, and his films tend to strike hard at contemporary issues, using violence and corruption as storytelling tools to keep the audience engaged. I've always loved his films, and this decade of films in general, but with corporations like Disney, Netflix, and Amazon making our movies today, I have genuinely found an appreciation for 80s films in general, even with the cheesy acting that I didn't quite understand when I was a kid. Hindsight has come into full focus on the 80s and what that wonderful decade brought us. It's why studios keep remaking movies and TV shows from it. Well, that and because they're creatively bankrupt. When rewatching Robocop, I got something from it that I hadn't noticed when I last watched it. Robocop is just as contemporary as today's films and TV shows. Heck, it even manages to predict some pretty incredible things. This realization gave me an epiphany. I do think that most movies before 2000 were basically story-driven first. I believe that most of the movies of the last century were pure enough to still be considered films, and not content. But the stories still reflect modern and cultural issues. Robocop at its core is about the dangers of capital cronyism and the dangers of public unions funded by government contractors, or maybe even more specifically, the privatization of a police force or a military, or some kind of a public service. And while it's more of a referendum on corporate greed during the Reagan era than it is the dangers of mixing government and corporations, it still finds a way to express those dangers beautifully, even if it is by accident. This realization made me understand something that I think many people, especially film critics online and on YouTube, are getting wrong when they say, just make movies without politics in them. The truth is that movies have always had modern politics in them. Contemporary basically means of its time, and this film is designed to be a film of its time. So if that's the case, then why are these movies of the last century, with modern politics laced throughout them, better than these movies? Well, for one, representation wasn't a core component of filmmaking, so the writing didn't have to reflect a priority of making every cast member an intersectional hero. And for another, the politics in older films were often portrayed artistically as a metaphor or expressed as a motif, and rarely was shoved in the audience's face, kind of like it is today. But I would say that none of these is the real reason. The real reason politics in movies is so awful today is because the messages are not something the general public agrees with, or maybe more specifically, the general public doesn't sympathize with. The messages are not populist. I'm going to say something that I don't want taken out of context, but I don't think that America is a cultural melting pot anymore, if it ever was one. We are more of a series of tribes where personal identities supersede responsible behaviors for a more perfect society. Whatever cultures people used to believe aren't actually melding into other cultures, but rather are shunned by society as quaint or uneducated, or are disappearing altogether, and being replaced by a more self-centered culture that doesn't really believe in community at all, even though they say the damn word all the time. Art is supposed to represent cultural issues that are generally agreed upon or at least sympathized with by the people, but ignored by their government and cultural leadership. That's kind of the whole point. But what happens when there's no shared culture? Today's most controversial ideas represented on screen are ones that are not shared or sympathized with by the people. Movies that have laughably strong women as the main action hero, an unrealistically diverse cast, or a movie espousing ideas from what the drinker likes to call the message are mostly not movies that appeal to the people. It's true that Hollywood is creatively bankrupt, but it's more than that. When they remake a movie, they can't help but put these new political messages in them that no one wants to see, and it's why everyone hates them. In other words, it's hard to be counterculture when there is no shared culture. And it's even harder to be counterculture when most of media, major corporations, and governments agree with your so-called counterculture messages. Robocop, as well as many movies satirizing corporate greed, can appeal to the masses because it's something most people can agree is a bad thing. It doesn't matter how right or wrong the message may be, but that it's an idea that most of culture today can get behind or at least sympathize with. The problem today is that art no longer represents what the people believe are the problems in our society. It's one of many reasons why 80s movies did it better, because they appeal to a wider audience with fresh ideas and cultural problems that everyone could get on board with, or at least understand where they're coming from. I, for instance, believe that the anti-Reaganomics message the movie is trying to employ hardly represents what actually happened when a more unleashed capitalism in the 80s helped to pull the US out of an inflationary and downed economy spiral with no end in sight. But the movie's message of greed overall, and the do whatever it takes to attain your goals no matter what the cost is attitude, is a message that should resonate to any moral person. My point is that while I certainly disagree with the anti-Reagan message, the movie is made in a way where it can at least be sympathized with by people like me. More than its heart-pounding action, More than its macho aesthetics and more than its gory shock value, Robocop is at its core a contemporary story using original ideas and unique aesthetics to tell it. It's a brilliant movie that arguably shouldn't have been touched again. Like the original Matrix film, this movie is an American classic and would have been seen with more reverence as a staple of its decade for its brilliance had it remained a standalone film. If you haven't seen this wonderful film and you love 80s movies, then drop what you're doing and watch this awesome classic. I give Robocop 4 6,000 SUXs out of 5. I'm the Mexican and I hope I've earned your subscription today. Tell me what you think about Robocop in the comments. By the way, I'm still very much at work on the next video essay, but I wanted to start a different series of older movie reviews because Star Wars is getting a bit stale, to put it mildly. And what do most Star Wars fans have in common? We love movies. So let me know what movie review you want to see next in the comments and let's talk about it. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.
I'd buy that for $1.